Welcome to the committee's first legislative hearing of the 119th Congress. Today we'll receive testimony on 6 bills listed in the notice for today's hearing. All these bills address domestic mining and mineral processing, related reporting, and public information. 4 of these measures have bipartisan co-sponsors, and a 5th has received some bipartisan support. Having served on this committee since 2011, I'm keenly aware that the United States has fallen behind China and other nations when it comes to mining and mineral processing. Today's hearing represents a first step in developing a legislative record on measures to address this very problem. Of course, not all of us will support each measure on which the committee will hear testimony today. I don't support all the bills listed on the notice for today's hearing. For example, although I agree that America needs to process more non-fuel minerals here at home, and I appreciate that Senator Hickenlooper's bill, S-596, has Republican co-sponsors, I've got strong reservations about the pilot program that this legislation would establish. Also, I included Senator Lujan's bill, S-859, in today's hearing as a courtesy. Senators Heinrich, Wyden, and Padilla are co-sponsors, along with a number of Democratic colleagues. Today's hearing is reflective of my intent to sharpen the committee's focus on legislation without diminishing our other responsibilities to consider presidential nominations or to conduct oversight within our committee's jurisdiction. We'll begin by moving pending nominations through the committee as soon as we have the requisite paperwork on these additional nominations. I want to thank Ranking Member Heinrich and all the members of the committee for helping identify the 6 bills that we will receive testimony on this morning. After I conclude my opening statement, we'll hear from Senator Heinrich for his opening statement, and thereafter I'll introduce our distinguished panel of witnesses. We'll hear the witness testimony and then move to a round of questions from members. Members will have 5 minutes for their questions, and we'll alternate between senators on one side of the dais and then the other. If you're here today, it's because you understand that America's economic strength and national security hinge ultimately on securing a reliable supply of key materials. Currently, a majority of the world's mineral extraction and refinement are controlled by adversarial countries. We've seen what happens when we rely on these nations for essential resources: supply chain disruptions, economic vulnerabilities, and ultimately, tragically, national security risks. It's time to fix that. The resources are here, right here in the United States, and we just need the right policies in order for us to be able to unleash them. My home state of Utah, for example, has 40 of the 50 minerals deemed essential by the U.S. Geological Survey. Yet bureaucratic delays and inconsistent regulations create often insurmountable barriers to domestic production. A 2024 S&P Global Survey found that U.S.-based mineral projects take an average of 29 years to move from discovery to production. That's the second longest timeline in the world. To put that in perspective, if a mine were needed for defense applications during World War I using today's permitting timelines, it wouldn't be operational until after World War II had come to an end. That is unacceptable. It's one of the reasons why I've introduced the Critical Mineral Consistency Act with my colleague from Arizona, Senator Mark Kelly. Right now, the Department of Energy and the Department of the Interior have separate, parallel, inconsistent lists of what counts as critical and what doesn't. That doesn't make any sense. In 2023, the Energy Department added copper to its list of critical materials, recognizing the metal as integral in energy technologies, but also at risk for supply disruptions by 2035. But the U.S. Geological Survey left copper off its own list, even though it's vital for power grids, wind turbines, and electric vehicles. My bill would require these lists to match. These designations send a powerful message to investors. The U.S. government is backing these supply chains on national security grounds. If we want private investment in domestic production, we need clarity and we need consistency. That's exactly why we need to pass Senators Cortez Masto and Risch's Mining Regulatory Clarity Act to enable mining on federal land. But streamlining regulations is only part of the equation. This doesn't get the whole thing. We need to get to streamlining regulations. We need to go beyond that and to truly strengthen our supply chains. We must also reject policies that create additional burdens on domestic production. Imposing additional federal royalties would only add cost and uncertainty, potentially shutting down existing projects and driving investment overseas. Overseas, specifically to nations with far worse, far inferior environmental and humanitarian standards than what we have here. It would create redundant fees, as domestic mining projects are already subject to state and local royalties and taxes. Simply put, these proposals would make our mineral supply chains less competitive, and it would make them more vulnerable, impacting everything from economic growth to national security. We cannot afford to drag our feet any longer. China is racing ahead in mineral processing and refining. We need to move faster, smarter, and more strategically. The United States has the resources, the talent, and the technology. We just need the right policies to lead this charge. That starts here, with hearings like this one that we're having today, with legislation like what we'll be discussing at this hearing. I look forward to working with my colleagues to ensure that we have the ability to unlock our full potential and secure America's mineral future. Thank you. I now recognize Senator Heinrich for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman. I am glad that we're holding this hearing today on a set of issues that are critically important to people and communities across the country, but particularly in the West. However, before turning to the topic of today's hearing, I think it's impossible to talk about any natural resource issue today without talking about the incredible damage being done to the workforce that manages those lands and resources for the American people. The illegal firings of probationary staff, rumored to be just the beginning of staffing reductions, is already reducing access to public lands with locked gates and closed visitor centers at parks across the country. What's more, as we're considering legislation intended to increase mineral production on public lands, this administration is cutting staff and land agencies that process those same permits. With a voluntary resignation offer that encouraged some of the most experienced, highest performing staff at these agencies to leave public service, along with the legal firings of staff who were recently promoted because of their high performance, this administration is crippling the very public land agencies that evaluate plans for new mines. Anyone who is hoping for government efficiency out of this administration can see that what we're actually getting is government dysfunction. Now, to today's hearing in particular, modern technologies involve a lot of raw materials. And as our scientists and engineers find new and cheaper ways to generate and store energy, the types and quantities of minerals used in energy technologies will only continue to grow. Responsible domestic mining and processing can be part of the solution, but we can't get there with outdated laws that don't reflect the nation's needs and priorities today. The law that governs metal mining on most public lands in the West was written in 1872, more than 150 years ago. Yellowstone had been a national park for barely 2 months when the mining law was signed, and New Mexico would still be a territory for another 40 years. We have actually learned quite a bit since 1872. How to manage public land for public benefit, how to conserve habitat for sustainable fish and wildlife populations, how to protect our drinking and irrigation water from heavy metals pollution, and how to ensure a fair return for the commercial development of resources that, after all, belong to the American people. And yet, our hard rock mining law remains stuck in the 19th century, right when we need to build the energy infrastructure of the 21st century. Updating the 1872 mining law could bring public land mining into the 21st century and provide the minerals that we need for the energy technologies of today. But we're here today to talk about more than just mining, because mining alone won't solve our supply chain dependence on adversaries unless we also invest in the entire life cycle of minerals. This includes increasing our domestic mineral processing capacity, continuing the onshoring of manufacturing through the CHIPS and Science Act, and investing in recycling technology so that we can reuse the minerals that we already have. The fact that we export copper and rare earth materials, as well as things like batteries, to China in the form of electronic waste is one of the more infuriating realities of our current system. We should be capturing and reusing the minerals present within our borders in devices, vehicles, batteries, and machinery, rather than paying to ship them overseas. I firmly believe we can find ways to secure the minerals we need for new energy technologies while also protecting our water, air, and public lands. I believe it's possible to open new mines while giving local communities a say in whether a particular location on public land is an appropriate place for a new mine, just like we do for oil and gas and other uses. And I'm confident that we can find a way to finally fund the cleanup of legacy mine pollution that contaminates streams and rivers across the West. I hope that today's hearing will be a step towards all of those goals.
Thank you, Senator Heinrich. Now be pleased to introduce each of our witnesses. It's my pleasure first to introduce and welcome Brian Summers, the president of the Utah Mining Association. Mr. Summers joined the association as its president back in 2019. He previously led the Utah Science, Technology, and Research Initiative as its managing director. Earlier in his career, Mr. Summers served in leadership and senior staff positions in the Utah state government and also in private industry. Our next witness is Mr. Rich Haddock. Mr. Haddock is an attorney who's worked in the mining industry for more than 30 years. He spent the last 25 years of that time at Barrick Gold Corporation in both legal and operational roles and retired as general counsel in 2022. Mr. Haddock is currently a senior advisor to Barrick. He's also a member of the board of directors of Perpetua Resources Corporation. I'm pleased to relate that Mr. Haddock holds a degree in geology from Brigham Young University and a law degree from the University of Utah School of Law. Finally, we'll hear from Mr. Chris Wood, the president and CEO of Trout Unlimited since 2001. Before joining Trout Unlimited, Mr. Wood served as the senior policy and communications advisor to the chief of the U.S. Forest Service, capping a career in government. He's the author and co-author of numerous papers and articles and 3 books. Okay, so we'll now hear from each of the witnesses. Mr. Haddock, we'll start with you, then move to Mr. Summers, and then Mr. Wood.
Chairman Lee, Ranking Member Heinrich, Senator Cortez Masto, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify today. I believe it is critical to competitiveness and national security for the United States to develop a secure mineral supply chain. One only needs to look at China's export ban of certain strategic minerals to understand this. I believe we can do much of what is necessary here at home with the domestic mining industry. Over the last 40 years, production of many critical minerals has become concentrated in just a few mines in unfriendly jurisdictions where global demands are met by a race to the bottom of price, of human rights standards, of labor standards, and of environmental standards. Often, critical minerals are produced only as byproducts and are found in very small quantities, along with gold, copper, lead, zinc, iron, and other economically viable minerals. The key to domestic production of as many of these minerals as possible is a healthy ecosystem for the U.S. mining industry, policy, expertise, and investment. The first step in creating a healthy mining ecosystem is before you today as S-544, the Mining Regulatory Clarity Act. This is a bipartisan bill I've testified in support of at the request of chairs from both parties. This bill addresses the confusion, delay, and continuing litigation created by the Ninth Circuit Rosemont decision, which upended decades of mining law interpretation and agency practice. Rosemont, if not addressed, would make it nearly impossible to site mine support facilities like mills, shafts, crushers, tailings facilities, and roads. In BLM regulatory parlance, these are called ancillary facilities, but I think necessary is really a better adjective because you can't have a mine without one, and I'm grateful the committee recognizes that. The version of the MRCA before you today responds to criticisms of the original bill, S. 1281, introduced by Senator Cortez Masto in the 118th Congress. Initially, industry and environmental groups worked together to develop a detailed savings clause to diffuse the criticism. When it persisted under Senator Cortez Masto's leadership, committee staff worked with industry representatives and environmental group representatives to produce this version of the bill. It's the same language this committee advanced last fall as part of the Energy Permitting Reform Act of 2024. The MRCA is narrowly tailored. Over the last 50 years, less than 1/3 of 1% of the land in Nevada has been included in a plan of operations. This is the state with the most mining and 85% federal land. Only a portion of the ground inside a plan of operations is disturbed, and only a part of that disturbed ground contains ancillary facilities. These subsection C mill sites created by the bill can only be located inside a proposed plan of operation, which only happens when you have a real mine. Real mines are few and far between, and honestly, I wish we had a few more, and perhaps our critical mineral concerns might not be as acute as they are today. So with that, I applaud that the Congress recognizes the strategic importance of minerals as represented by the three bills before the committee, the three critical mineral bills before the committee. I thank the sponsors for their work on these bills. The Chairman's Critical Mineral Consistency Act is common sense, one list that is dynamic to guide policy. I applaud the goals of the Critical Minerals Future Act, S596, because it recognizes there are market forces that inhibit the domestic production of these minerals and proposes ways to begin to address those forces. I thank Senator Hickenlooper and his staff for their extensive outreach to industry and effort on the bill. I also appreciate that S789 recognizes the U.S. needs to be as resource savvy as our global competitors. Importantly, I think these bills underscore the need to focus on and improve our knowledge of potential domestic resources for these minerals, which I believe should be our long-term primary goal. And finally, while not today's topics, I would be remiss if I didn't, number one, thank the committee and Environment and Public Works for recognizing that permitting and associated judicial review needs to be improved, and for your ongoing work on these issues. And number two, acknowledge, thank, and congratulate Senator Heinrich for his tireless effort on the Good Samaritan bill last year, which was a great step in the right direction, and we were delighted to see signed into law. Thank you, and I look forward to any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Haddock. We'll hear from Mr. Summers next.
Chairman Lee, Ranking Member Heinrich, and other members of the committee, thank you for the invitation to testify. Mining is a critical industry in Utah, contributing $7.7 billion to the state's GDP, supporting nearly 57,000 direct and indirect jobs, and powering Utah's broader economy by producing the coal, which provides 62% of Utah's low-priced electricity. Mining jobs in Utah are family and community-sustaining jobs, with mining salaries averaging 46% more than the average Utah wage. The recent actions of China to ban or restrict the export of critical minerals or mineral processing technologies, which they control, should highlight the need to strengthen our domestic mining and mineral processing capabilities and reshore critical mineral supply chains. Of the 10 minerals or mineral groups currently subject to Chinese export bans or restrictions, rare earth elements, antimony, germanium, gallium, graphite, tungsten, tellurium, bismuth, molybdenum, and indium, Utah has the capacity to produce 9. Utah is currently producing rare earth elements, tellurium, and molybdenum. Utah has proven and very rare primary resources of germanium, gallium, and indium, and significant historical production of antimony, tungsten, and bismuth. As the chairman mentioned, Utah hosts 40 of the 50 critical minerals on the Department of Interior's current critical mineral list. 40 of the 50 critical minerals in just one state, admittedly one with an unusually rich and diverse mineral endowment. Add occurrences of critical minerals in other states, and there's little reason the U.S. should be as dependent as it is on foreign critical mineral supply chains, again, with our geopolitical adversary China as the dominant global producer. Our current situation is the result of a lack of investment in and support of our domestic mining and mineral processing industries, as well as outright market manipulation by China and other foreign mineral producers. The U.S. mining industry is committed to responsibly developing our mineral resources, and it is appropriate that the U.S. has stringent labor, safety, financial, and environmental regulations. However, these regulations must also be rational, stable, economically feasible, and not misaligned with the regulatory environments of other free and developed nations with major mining industries, nations like Canada and Australia. The chairman also mentioned the report from S&P Global that found that the U.S. has the second longest timeline in the world for developing a new mine, 29 years, the worst record of any country in the world except for Zambia. That report states, quote, "The development of a mine in the U.S. is not only long and costly, it is unusually uncertain. While developing a mine in Canada or Australia can also take a long time, those mines do reliably enter production. In the U.S., even if mines receive all required permits, they are subject to higher litigation risk. Uncertainty and litigation risk may explain why exploration budgets committed by investors to Canada and Australia over the last 15 years have been 81% and 57% higher than to the U.S., close quote. If the U.S. is to have any chance of becoming self-sufficient in supplying its own critical mineral needs, Congress and the federal government must commit to real permitting reform, litigation reform, ending federal land and mineral withdrawals, renewing the diminishment of state primacy for the enforcement of federal labor and environmental laws, reversing the decline of mining engineering programs in U.S. universities, providing grants for research into new mineral extraction and processing technologies, and providing incentive to attract more mineral exploration and other mining investment to the U.S. A positive first step is the recent introduction of the Critical Mineral Consistency Act of 2025 by Chairman Lee and Senator Kelly. This act will end the misalignment between the Department of Interior's Critical Mineral List and the Department of Energy's Critical Materials List. If the act is passed, it will have a positive effect on Utah as we are a major copper-producing state. In fact, Utah is home to one of the largest and most productive copper mines in the world, the Rio Tinto Kennecott Bingham Canyon Mine. Rio Tinto Kennecott is not only a world-class copper operation and has one of only 2 working copper smelters in the U.S., it is also Utah's largest producer of critical minerals, currently producing tellurium, platinum, and palladium, and with the potential to produce rare earth elements, indium, germanium, gallium, and many other critical minerals through secondary recovery. The example of Rio Tinto Kennecott highlights the fact that many critical minerals are commingled with base metals, precious metals, and other mineral commodities, and why we must not only support and invest in new mines, but also expand production and secondary recovery at existing mines and mineral processing facilities. Another Utah success story on this front is the Energy Fuels White Mesa Mill in Blanding, Utah. The White Mesa Mill is the last functioning conventional uranium mill in the U.S. and which is now also processing monazite, a mineral byproduct which contains uranium but also high concentrations of rare earth elements. Using an existing and already permitted facility and a high dose of rural Utah ingenuity, the White Mesa Mill has created the most advanced rare earth element processing operation outside of China, a great step toward ending that nation's stranglehold on the rare earth supply chain. Again, I appreciate the opportunity to highlight some of Utah's success stories and to discuss how the federal government can better support state efforts to lead on the critical minerals front. I look forward to any questions from the committee. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Summers. Mr. Wood, you're next.
Chairman Lee, Ranking Member Heinrich, and other committee members, thank you very much for inviting me to testify today. Trout Unlimited has been involved in mining issues for a long time, from protecting special places such as Bristol Bay in Alaska to working with the mining industry and other partners to clean up legacy pollution from abandoned mines. Domestic mineral production helped to build our nation. It won 2 world wars. It fueled westward expansion and provides the raw materials for modern society. Excuse me. At the same time, historic mining left hundreds of thousands of abandoned mines that dot the landscape, leaching their toxic brew of lead, zinc, cadmium, arsenic, and other pollutants into our rivers and streams. To be certain, there is no constituency for acid mine waste and orange rivers. There is, however, a bipartisan commitment to clean up abandoned mines, to encourage responsible mining, and to propel the needs of a clean energy future while making our rivers and streams cleaner and our communities healthier. Working together, we have an opportunity to craft a path forward that is collaborative, innovative, and responsible. In 1872, the General Mining Law helped to spur settlement of the West. Today, it is an anachronism in need of modernization. The EPA estimates that 40% of Western headwater streams are negatively affected by abandoned hard rock mines. These are by and large not contemporary mines. They were built many decades or even a century ago. An analysis conducted by Trout Unlimited scientists found that approximately 110,000 miles of streams, enough to encircle the Earth 4 times, are listed as impaired and and abandoned mines are a major source of these impairments. Thanks last year to the leadership of Senator Heinrich, Senator Risch, and many other members of this committee, Congress passed the Good Samaritan Remediation of Abandoned Hard Rock Mines Act of 2024. The new law is proof that the mining industry and conservation interests can find common ground and pass common sense mining legislation. Tens of thousands of abandoned mines negatively affect our nation's waters. The reality is that this is a completely solvable problem. Just about every commodity produced from our public lands has an associated royalty or fee that helps to address remediation from legacy development. I appreciate that mining companies must make years and often millions of dollars in investments before they can mine. But there should be a common sense royalty once new mines are up and running to help pay for the cleanup of legacy mines. The coal industry alone has paid more than $12 billion in royalties since 1977 to help clean up abandoned coal mines across Appalachia and parts of the West. If we can do it with coal, we can do it with hard rock minerals, especially given the immense need. Finally, professional land managers should be able to deny a mine if it is proposed in a community drinking water supply, a sacred site, or an exceptional fish and wildlife habitat. But that denial should happen early in the process, before a mining company has invested tens of millions of dollars in exploration or development. Between the industry's desire for certainty, the confusion caused by the Rosemont decision, the obvious need for a royalty, and the equally obvious need for some measure of discretion as to where mining can and should occur, there is an agreement to be had. We have fought and bickered and disagreed over mining on public lands for over 100 years. Certainly, there is a common sense compromise within our reach that would provide sufficient dedicated funding for abandoned mine cleanups, allow that certain landscapes are inappropriate for mining, and at the same time address the legal and regulatory certainty needed for investment by the mining industry. You have Trout Unlimited's commitment to continue working in good faith to strike that balance. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today.
Thanks so much for your opening testimony. We'll now proceed to questions. We'll go alternating between Republicans and Democrats in 5-minute rounds. Mr. Summers, I'd like to start with you. Last month, I introduced a bill called the Critical Mineral Consistency Act, and I did this in order to try to align the Department of the Interior's critical mineral list with the Department of Energy's critical materials list. Can you explain for us, Mr. Summers, why both critical minerals and critical materials are essential to the United States, particularly with regard to our economic, energy, and national security?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I applaud you for introducing this particular piece of legislation, because the disparities between the lists that the federal government has maintained, especially between the DOI list and the DOE list, has been perplexing to the mining industry for a number of years now. And in many cases, again, when you're talking about critical minerals specifically, a lot of these critical minerals, as I mentioned in my testimony, are co-located with base metals and precious metals and other things that may not appear on either of these lists. But in particular, in the case of Utah, again, our most productive copper mine is also our most productive critical mineral mine. And so making sure that you have equal consideration from the federal government for both the critical minerals and minerals like copper is really essential. The other issue that comes to the fore here is that, regardless of what national defense technology or energy transmission technology you're talking about, I mean, they're going to rely both on things like copper and on some of the more boutique minerals, that are on the critical minerals list. And so, while you have a large number of rare earths, for example, that will go into an F-35, which we have a lot of in Utah, you also need a lot of copper to make an F-35. You also need, vanadium for the alloys that go into those airframes. And so, again, having some consistency from the federal perspective when it comes to any potential fast-track permitting or grants and research and other things is essential in order for us.
Why does it matter for us to try to produce those in the United States rather than importing them?
Right, absolutely. I mean, again, as you've seen from the recent actions of China, I mean, if you have something like antimony, for example, that's banned, that prevents us from manufacturing munitions in the United States because those are critical to go into, again, munitions and national defense systems and other things. And so it does become a national security risk if we're reliant on foreign producers, and especially adversarial foreign producers for those minerals.
Makes sense. Mr. Haddock, in your testimony, you noted that Nevada, where Barrick operates, is a state with a lot of federal land. And Utah faces, of course, a similar challenge with 67% of our land being owned by the federal government. When it comes to mineral development, what additional hurdles do companies face when trying to develop these things when they're operating on federal land as compared to either state land or private land?
The additional hurdle is permitting. It's the timeline for permitting. The permitting timelines on state or federal land would be much quicker, and then, of course, the litigation risk on the tail end, where almost every project is litigated. It makes it very difficult to spend a lot of money. Like some projects, you would spend $500 million before you'd get to the point of permitting it. That's a lot of money to sit there for a long time.
But when you're going in to operate on either state land or private land, there's still permitting required. There's still a potential litigation risk. Tell me how that risk and the corresponding delays compare between the two.
There is kind of a broader range of litigation risk because of, number one, NEPA. The agencies, the federal agencies that administer the public lands do an absolutely great job of bringing together mountains of data, analyzing all the range of issues that they have to that they have to consider under the various laws. But what tends to happen in those cases is that the courts tend to fly spec the EISs and nitpick until they find one issue that they don't think has been adequately addressed, and then you're back to supplemental EIS.
Okay, so does that suggest that the additional time consumed in the federal process doesn't necessarily produce a cleaner, safer outcome? It's more fly specking and time consuming, but not necessarily with a corresponding benefit to environmental quality. And if this is the case, how does this impact, how does that situation compounded by recent court decisions, how does that impact investment and project development?
Well, it makes it harder to invest, but you're absolutely right. NEPA was enacted before many of the detailed federal environmental laws that have performance standards. And what commonly happens is, whether you're working on state land or federal or private land or federal land, you have to comply with all those laws. What typically happens through an EIS process is additional mitigation measures are imposed, additional performance standards are imposed, and then they're litigated over. So that's kind of the additional burden from that.
Thank you. My time's expired. Senator Heinrich.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Wood, according to the GAO, there are at least 140,000 abandoned hard rock mine features just on federal land. And GAO actually points out itself that information where those sites are is so lacking that the true number may actually be closer to 500,000 features on public land alone. That leads into the dynamic that you described of something like 40% of headwater streams being impaired, places that should run clear and be home to trout running orange and acidic. Which certainly impacts both irrigation, municipal water supplies. Walk us through what the primary impediments are to being able to clean up those sites, and how much of it is purely a resource constraint.
Well, thanks to your good work, sir, on the Good Samaritan remediation of abandoned Hard Rock Mines Act, one of the primary problems, liability issues, are at least they're being addressed in a pilot program over the next 7 years. But the single largest, the most fundamental challenge that we face on cleaning up abandoned mines is that there's no dedicated funding source for it. So TU has managed to do about 50 abandoned mine cleanups around the country, And the way we're able to do that in spite of the liability is we get federal agencies to agree to hold the liability for us. And it's only on public land that we can do that. But we have to beg, borrow, and steal to get that money. It's membership dollars. It's the mining industry, frankly, has been generous in supporting a lot of abandoned mine cleanups. Foundations, private citizens. There's no, unlike with coal, unlike with oil, unlike with gas, there's no dedicated funding source that we can rely on.
Mr. Barrick, is it reasonable to expect mining companies to make some contribution towards that effort?
Senator, the way, let me answer that one this way. We have said over the years that we would support a reasonable net royalty. Now, there are, as you've heard me say before, there are issues about that, including that we should look at total government take. And when you look at total government take in the form of taxes and royalties to state and local governments, the amount that you pay to operate in Nevada is really commensurate with what we would pay to operate in Australia or Canada. That said, we support a reasonable net royalty. Net royalty is preferable because in the hard rock mineral context, the ore bodies are extremely complex and different, and net actually recognizes the difference between ore bodies. You don't have to go about determining what kind of royalty rate for which ore body. The other thing I would note is the way we have to remember the state and local taxes, because the way the mining law was set up to begin with was it really left taxation and royalties to state governments. It's interesting because when they pulled oil and gas out of the mining law in 1920, they made the royalty a federal royalty, but then the federal government collects it and then distributes it back to the states. Yeah. And so with that, I would say that we would support actually a reasonable net royalty that is earmarked at first for abandoned mine land reclamation.
Great. No, that's very helpful. So it sounds like the main issues here are creating some sort of regulatory certainty and permitting certainty so that capital doesn't have to be ridiculously patient. There's the issue of actually being able to have some sort of revenue source that is reasonable to be able to clean up the existing mine lands problem. And then the issue that Mr. Wood brought up of some level of discretion within the public land management agencies so that you don't get into the sort of intractable arguments that oftentimes lead to litigation. Do you foresee, Mr. Haddock, a potential sort of global solution here where you could have a lot more certainty at the front end and then come up with a reasonable number that does take into account those variations and then be able to have a more predictable way to clean up all of the legacy issues?
I think all of those things can happen without wholesale revision of the mining law. Those are discrete issues that I think can be addressed discreetly. My view on kind of certainty up front is that's what the BLM's land resource planning process is about. And I think that's where the certainty needs to come. That's where the resources that need to be protected need to be identified, because once you start exploring, you need to be able to continue.
So you basically need a map of like where this is going to be embraced and it's permissive, and where are the places where maybe there's enough of a conflict that it's not appropriate.
And that process exists and is in place today in the BLM districts.
Thank you.
Senator Daines.
Chairman, thank you. Talk about the Bull Mountains coal mine. This is a mine near Roundup, Montana. Plays a crucial role in Montana's energy economy. The mine employs 250 people. These are high-paying jobs with good benefits, generates over $90 million a year in state, local, and federal taxes and revenues. It is the lifeblood of Muscle County. Unfortunately, these jobs are now at risk, and the life of the mine and the community it serves are in limbo. It's because of the checkerboard federal ownership in Montana, as well as this long wall mining process, this mine is running out of permitted coal and might be forced to close. And this is why I introduced Senate Bill 362. It's a targeted, short-term fix that allows the mining of very specific federal minerals to ensure that we have enough time to find a longer-term solution for the mine. This bill simply allows the mine to continue mining the same materials it has for decades under the same permit it's had for years. Last Congress, this committee passed this identical bill with a bipartisan vote. I want to thank my colleagues in this committee for working with me to make that happen, and I hope we can again pass this short-term fix so these workers in Montana can continue to provide for their families. Mining jobs saw a major hit in Montana over the last couple of years. The Bull Mountains mine recently had to lay off dozens of hardworking Montanans because they've run out of permitted coal. And recently, the Stillwater mine, the United States' only platinum and palladium mine, which is used in catalytic converters to keep our air clean, it recently laid off 700 Montanans. We can't afford the loss of any more jobs for these Montana miners. That's why we must pass this bill and get it on the President's desk. Mr. Summers, as the President of the Utah Mining Association, you understand how vital the mining industry is to building jobs, local communities, national security, tax revenues. In Montana, coal-fired plants provide the largest share of Montana's electricity generation, accounting for 45% of Montana's in-state generation. The coal industry not only supplies Americans with low-cost, reliable, and secure source of energy, it's called baseload power, but it also generates millions of dollars of federal, state, and local revenue per year and creating hundreds of very good-paying jobs in Montana. Mr. Summers, can you speak to the importance of supporting our coal jobs and ensuring that coal mines, like the Bull Mountains mine in Montana, continues to provide revenue for our states as well as our counties?
Absolutely. Thank you, Senator. Utah is very similar to Montana with regard to its coal industry. We also deal with checkerboard ownership. We deal with, underground mines and the planning that has to go into that. And like Montana, the vast majority of our electricity is provided by coal-fired generation. I mentioned in my testimony that, mining jobs on average in Utah pay about 46% more than the Utah average wage. But when you go into our coal-producing counties, that number can actually go over 100%. So in many of our coal-producing counties, especially in central Utah, coal mining companies are by far the largest private employer and provide very essential revenue, and not just for the direct mining jobs, but for all of the service jobs that go into those particular industries. And Utah in particular like Montana, has made a very concerted effort to ensure that our coal mines stay healthy and also that our coal-fired generation plants are preserved and are able to provide that essential baseload power so that we can continue to have the type of economic growth that we've become used to in Utah over the last number of years.
It's fascinating when you have conversations with technology leaders today. You're chatting with whether it's Google or AWS, or Microsoft, and others. Before we start talking about the technology, perhaps AI, the first conversation right now is the shortage of baseload power. It is the constraint for innovation here for our country long term, and grateful that we have baseload power, these coal-fired plants. Chairman Lee, I want to close by saying thanks for holding this hearing. I can't stress enough the importance of passing this bill, Senate Bill 362. It's been passed before this committee, ensuring that the Roundup and the Muscle Shale community isn't left behind because of federal inaction. The federal government's been slow rolling this. This is a short-term fix to allow the processes to finally become completed for a long-term solution. This will allow enough time for the Trump administration to finalize a new permit, for Congress to pass legislation like my Crow Revenue Act to bring long-term economic certainty for the workers, Muscle Shale County, as well as the Crow Reservation and the Crow Nation. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Thank you, Senator Daines. We'll turn next to Senator King.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This discussion reminds me of a little-known biblical provision where God came to Moses and said, I have good news and bad news. Moses says, what's the good news? God said, I'm going to allow you to part the waters of the Red Sea. My people will escape. The waters will then come back and engulf Pharaoh's army. Moses said, God, that's wonderful. What's the bad news? You prepared the environmental impact statement. Sorry. I couldn't resist. Mr. Haddock, why does the permitting take so long? I used to work on permitting of energy projects. We thought 4 or 5 years was a long time. Why does it take 29 years? What are the bottlenecks?
The permitting itself doesn't take 29 years, but the average EIS is about 4 years for mining project now. There is a massive amount of baseline data and work that has to go in back, in an iterative process with the agency. And there are just detailed studies, and then at the tail end, there are massive numbers of comments that then have to be responded to that require additional work. It is just a very long process that is at this point managed by very dedicated, very capable federal employees that are stretched very thin.
We hope that those federal employees will still be here after the next several months, but that's another subject. What about how do we look on cooperation with our international neighbors? For example, Canada, Australia, allies. Do we need to have more cooperative relationships in that situation, Mr. Summers? Talk about mining as an international factor.
Sure. And I think that we do have to distinguish between countries that are allies and countries that have similar environmental and labor standards like Canada and Australia, as you mentioned. A good example of cooperation that we see in Utah is the production of tellurium. So tellurium is mined at the Bingham Canyon mine, Rio Tinto Kennecott mine, and then it's actually sent to Montreal for processing, and then is sent back to Utah and to Arizona for manufacturing. And
I don't want to calculate the tariff on that going back.
Sure. But I do think that, again, finding ways to utilize allied supply chains and also utilize existing facilities is very important, because in many cases you're going to be able to get to actual production much quicker if you're utilizing existing facilities than if you're trying to build them from greenfield operations.
Absolutely. So one word that hasn't been mentioned much this morning is processing. My understanding, for example, that a great deal of lithium comes from Australia, but something like 85% of the processing is done in China. Should we also be talking about processing when we're talking about mining? Aren't they interrelated in a way? Because ultimately we need the product, the result of the processing.
Absolutely. If you're producing extracted minerals here in the U.S., but you're having to send them to China or another unfriendly nation for processing, then you haven't really solved the problem at all. So processing needs to be part of this conversation at every level.
So that should be part of what we're discussing here in terms of bottlenecks in that process. And I think you touched on this, but my notes were, who pays for abandoned mine cleanup? And it sounds like it's sort of catch as catch can, Mr. Wood. It's not. There's no steady source of available funds.
That's right. And I would be remiss not to mention again that the mining industry has been very supportive of helping to clean up abandoned mines, so long as they don't have to hold the liability. But that's the big problem, is we don't have a dedicated funding source to get ahead of these abandoned mines that dot the landscape.
One sort of parenthetical question. Mr. Summers, you mentioned a mine that was producing a lot of important minerals, and there were other minerals there which could be produced at that mine. If you're going after lithium and you discover tellurium, do you have to go through another permitting process, or can that mine expand its production of additional materials without additional delay?
To be honest, that depends on the operation and depends on the regulatory environment within the state where that operation is taking place. But in most cases, it is easier to go to produce new minerals from an existing permitted facility, because in many cases it's a matter of finding ways, through secondary recovery processes to pull other minerals out of a waste stream in many cases. And so again, it depends on the type of operation, but generally you're better off and can get to actual production quicker if you're using existing permitted facilities.
Thank you. I'm out of time. Mr. Haddock, I don't want to continue our discussion of net versus gross royalties. And if you would give us some written material on why mining should be treated different than oil and gas or coal in terms of the way the royalty is calculated. So we're out of time here, but look forward to having some, maybe a page or two on that subject. Thank you.
I can point you to the materials we've submitted to the committee before, and I'll do that.
Thank you.
Senator Cortez Masto.
Thank you. Thank you to the panelists. Rich and Chris, great to see you again. Mr. Summers, thank you for joining us as well. And I'm going to do this on behalf of my mining companies in Nevada, but I know they would invite any senator on this panel to come and see hard rock mining in the state of Nevada. I think it is important to see it and understand what is going on, to recognize the challenges that they're facing and why they are talking about net royalties. So I appreciate that. Thank you also for the hard work that I know you have done on the Mining Clarity Act and the work that we have done together to really focus on some of the challenges that we heard at the last committee. Now, this is based on those challenges. We amended it. It passed out of committee in a bipartisan way last Congress, but I want to put to bed some of the stuff that we're still hearing out there with respect to this act. So, Mr. Haddock, if you would, when we came together to address some of the concerns that we heard last time, because there were concerns about that the Mining Clarity Act would allow mining in national parks, monuments, and other withdrawn areas. Can you address that? Can you talk a little bit about whether that's true or not?
The savings clause in the Act makes clear, and we worked extensively with Trout Unlimited and others on that it does not affect any of the laws that govern mining in the parks, or doesn't change anything that's been withdrawn. If it's been withdrawn, it's gone. And I think it's crystal clear in the Act.
Mr. Wood, you would agree?
I would.
Thank you. And then, Mr. Haddock, can you also confirm that the savings clause and the restructuring of the language, which includes adding the provision to deposit the mill site annual maintenance fees into an abandoned mine reclamation cleanup fund, exists? And that was part of this discussion as we tried to address some of the concerns. We recognize there's not a dedicated funding source, but this was an attempt to try to start that process. Is that right?
It was, and it was a really convenient way to do it because this is a new kind of mining claim. And it was great to just tie it to mine reclamation, abandoned mine reclamation.
Yeah, and if you would address the new kind of mining claim, because this new language limits where these new mill site claims can be located. And there's an accusation that somehow this is also a land giveaway, or that new claims would blanket all of our public lands. Would you address that?
Yes, that new claims won't blanket all of our public lands. As I've said, it's only a very, very small percentage of Nevada's lands that's even inside a plan of operations, compared to the 22% that's already been withdrawn and the 9% that's proposed to be withdrawn. We're talking about a tiny percentage of 1% of the state that is in plans of operations. And only part of that is the ancillary facilities. And so in order to locate one of these new subsection C mill sites, you have to have a plan of operations. You have to have a real mine. You just can't go out and put them anywhere on federal land. You have to have been working there. You have to have been drilling. You've prepared a plan of operations. You're going into an EIS. You've spent tens of millions of dollars at a minimum
For that plan of operation. And then, Mr. Haddock, finally, this bill does not overturn or reverse the Rosemont decision. The bill leaves Rosemont in place. It just creates a new path that miners can choose to take. Can you discuss under what circumstances a mining company may choose to take this new path?
Well, from my perspective, it's an easy choice because it's clear, and I don't have to fight in permitting over whether or not a given load claim is valid in the sense that it has a mineable economically mineable mineral deposit on it before I put my crusher on top of that. I don't have to argue about whether or not that claim's still valid when I have mined through it in the underground and I still have a crusher sitting on top of it. It eliminates those issues.
Right, but a mining company can choose. If they want to go under the Rosemont decision as the way it exists, they can move through that path, or they can move through this path, setting forth an operational plan with a mill site and contributing to abandoned mine cleanup. Is that right?
They can.
Okay,
And
so there's still a choice for...
there's still a choice.
Okay, I appreciate that. And then finally, let me just say thank you to all of you. You've heard the hurdles. There's no doubt the permitting process is the hurdle. We absolutely need to, in the West, make sure that our federal agencies that are crucial to us continuing this mining, and in Nevada, it is the BLM and DOI, that they're adequately funded and staffed. But we also have to make sure, and I'm going to put a fine point on this, that those people in those positions can't use their positions to delay permitting by putting it off just because they don't like the permitting or the mining that is going on. That is not their choice to do. And so we have to address both ends of it when we're looking at moving forward to address the permitting process of this as well. So I thank you again to the chairman and ranking member for this hearing.
Let's see. Senator Gallego is next.
Thank you, Chairman Lee and Ranking Member Heinrich, and thank you to our witnesses for your attendance today. I've been outspoken about the need to shore up our critical mineral supply chains for years, especially for our national security and just our energy future. And Arizona certainly can be a leader in this space. Over 70% of the nation's copper comes from Arizona, along with gold, silver, zinc, and many others. As we produce these minerals and metals, advanced technology, contribute to our economy, and build infrastructure, we can do so in a way that protects our natural resources too. So I'm glad to see multiple bipartisan bills that are critical, bills critical minerals in this hearing, and look forward to continuing work on these issues. So my first question is for Mr. Wood. You mentioned in your testimony that historic mining has threatened drinking water supply and quality. In states like mine, water is a very scarce resource that must be conserved and clean. What other actions can the federal government take to protect and remediate our water in the context of mining and critical mineral supply chains?
Thank you, sir, for your question. An important step was taken last year with the passage of the Good Samaritan legislation, which will allow for 12 pilot projects over the next 7 years, and then we have every intent of coming back and trying to authorize that legislation to remove the liability hurdles that organizations like mine or mining companies would face by trying to clean up those abandoned mines. But the second, as again, I mentioned this earlier, but the second point is paramount today. It's funding. There's just no funding for it. There's no dedicated funding source. So even if you didn't have concerns about liability, you still have to go out and cobble together hundreds of thousands, occasionally millions of dollars to do these cleanup projects.
Mm-hmm. My next question is for Mr. Haddock. Please expand on how the Critical Minerals Consistency Act would decrease uncertainty about research and tax credits, especially those passed by Congress in the last few years.
Senator, I'm sorry, that last part about the consistency would affect
would decrease uncertainty about research and tax credits, especially those passed by Congress in the last few years.
Well, I think the act simply decreases the uncertainty in mine permitting, and I don't think it really affects the research and that end of things.
Okay, Mr. Wood, back to my question earlier. You said that some of these cleanups can be hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars. Is there any national estimate of how much of a cleanup on an annual basis budget do we need to actually be effectively cleaning up some of these sites?
On an annual basis?
Yeah.
It'd be nice if we had $1 billion a year, but I'm just pulling that out of the air.
It'd be nice if a lot of us had $1 billion.
Yeah, a lot of these projects, to be clear, they're minor construction sites, mm-hmm. and my engineers get mad at me whenever I say this, but in many cases, you're dealing with tailings, and you dig a ditch, you line it with an impermeable barrier, you bulldoze the tailings in there, put another impermeable barrier, maybe you dig a French drain around it, and then you walk away. Mm-hmm. So a lot of these aren't Superfund sites that we're talking about. These are often low-tech, construction projects. They get more expensive. The reason I used the millions word was if you have to do something like build a wastewater treatment plant, that obviously will be more expensive than just doing a small construction project.
Okay, all right, thank you. I yield back.
That's fine.
So with respect to Senator Gallego's question, the EPA estimates that the total liability for these sites is about $54 billion. Yeah. So if we had $1 billion a year, it would still take 54 years to get these sites cleaned up.
Senator Hickenlooper.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks for having both you and the ranking member having this hearing. And Mr. Haddock, good to see you, and Mr. Summers and Mr. Wood, nice to see you again. Obviously, I got a master's in geology back in 1979. Spent a fair amount of time looking at the difference between geology and resources, and what the difference is between what could a load that could be a mine and a load that couldn't be a mine. I think if you go back and look on a broader scale, we're facing challenges now that's going to require a much higher level of precision when we make those decisions. And Mr. Haddock, obviously, you've been clear, you and Summers both, in terms of we have that capability now to a large extent. Our office has introduced 3 bills on critical minerals. We're part of a number of other bills, and they're smaller bills, but they are demanding. We're trying to drive innovation, strengthen coordination, make sure we have the appropriate alliances. But I thought this does seem like a moment of alignment where we could actually have a more comprehensive bill that looked at that alignment of self-interest in terms of, really, I think many people, and my first question will be towards you, Mr. Wood, whether you agree with this, that many people in the environmental community recognize that we're going to need a lot more critical minerals if we're going to deal with the challenges of climate change. More electric vehicles, wind, solar, all these things demand not just rare earth minerals, but nickel and copper, things like this. And so, Mr. Wood, just to start that, do you think it's possible that can you imagine some sort of a consensus from the environmental side of things that we could help establish what would be the criteria, the framework by which mining could take place and processing could take place, and by so setting standards, we would then export them once we worked our way through that, but I'm not saying this happens easily. Is that something you can imagine?
I can absolutely imagine that. I don't think we're that far apart. Coming up with I'm not an expert in royalties, but coming up with a reasonable royalty, I think is achievable, it sounds like. Building some discretion, whether it's at the land use plan or upon enactment of a bill to make clear that some areas are suitable for development, some aren't. That sounds achievable. And so I would be remiss if I didn't say that rare earth minerals and minerals generally are absolutely vital for the future of this country. And so I'd rather we mine them here and give the industry the certainty it needs while providing the protections that conservation demands.
Great. And I agree. I think this is almost a unique time where we have what is too often rare in government is the alignment of self-interest. And that's when, whether you're working in nonprofits or in businesses or in government, the alignment of self-interest is the secret to progress. Mr. Haddock, we introduced the Critical Materials Future Act to really expand domestic processing of critical minerals and directly reduce our reliance on China. It's been already said several times that China does so much of the processing for so many of these minerals. Can you elaborate a little bit on the need for investments both in domestic mining but also domestic processing?
Well, it's obviously important to have processing onshore if you can have it. The materials that we would mine and concentrate for processing are still bulk materials, and they are expensive to ship.
Right.
So if you have, all things being equal, if you have domestic processing, that promotes a domestic industry. The other thing I would add is just to kind of put it in context, over the last 2 decades, China has invested $57 billion in critical mineral supply chain, onshore and offshore. They have recognized the need for that, and they have been very aggressive. And so that's why so much mineral processing is in China.
Right. Yeah, I agree. Thank you. Mr. Summers, just real quickly, expanding domestic mining and processing is going to require a skilled workforce. We have only 600 students in the United States right now that are enrolled in mining-related programs. Many of them are at Colorado School of Mines, I'm proud to say. China has 1.4 million students in mining. How are we going to address this?
Yeah, thank you, Senator. I think that is a huge problem, and not just for the technical degrees of mining engineering, chemical engineering, and other degrees, but also throughout all for skilled trades and other things. I think that the Mining Schools Act that was considered in the last Congress is a good first step in that provides some opportunities for our currently certified mining schools to go out and recruit more students and have more resources available to them. But solving that workforce problem is critical if we're going to be able to reshore these supply chains.
Right. Thank you all. And I yield back only because I have to. I could spend the afternoon talking to you. Yield back.
Thanks, Senator Hickenlooper. We'll now start the second round. Mr. Haddock, I'd like to start with you. A few minutes ago, you mentioned you'd be okay with a new net royalty. But that's not, of course, what's being proposed in S-859. How do you think a gross royalty as proposed in S-859 would affect the industry and would affect essential mining investment and development?
Well, it would be devastating as the testimonies we submitted on the predecessor to this bill showed that kind of royalty would take 67% of the value of the operation. It would take it up from about 30, where we spend today for total government take, to 2/3 of the operation, and that just would make the United States impossible to do business in.
So you add that on top of the other burdens, and it would make it an impossibility. Now, Mr. Summers, if there were a net royalty, there might be some businesses, some companies, I suspect, that could absorb that and deal with it. But what would that do to the state of competition in the industry, particularly as it relates to smaller companies, those that are less established? How would they fare in that environment when they had a net royalty added on top of the pre-existing burdens that we've been discussing today?
Yeah, I think it would be very damaging, and especially, again, when the resources obviously don't move, but the capital can move. And so companies are going to invest where they're going to get the best return. And I think especially in the mining industry, where we rely very much on small exploration companies and on junior mining companies to develop many of these mineral deposits, and then in many cases they will be sold off to larger companies. I think that having anything that hampers investment, especially in those smaller companies in that front end of the mining, those front end mining operations, would be very damaging in the long term.
So we have to look at this, I suppose, as one of many market signals. If we were to do that, like I say, even though some larger companies could absorb it, a lot of the newer exploration, or at least a significant amount of the new development, the new exploration, is undertaken by startups, by smaller companies, who have to respond to all kinds of market signals that have to take into account whether there's federal land involved, whether to what extent there is federal permitting involved, whether to what extent there is a federal litigation risk associated with that permitting. You add more things on top of that, including a royalty, a new royalty, whether that's gross or even net. Doesn't that, in many circumstances, chill investment in the United States and effectively drive it elsewhere?
Yeah, absolutely, and I think it also goes in opposition to what many of the states are trying to do to bring investment to their states. So in Utah, for example, over the past few years, we've passed 2 different tax credits that incentivize mineral exploration and also high-cost infrastructure associated with mining operations and other extractive operations. And so if you have the states moving in a direction where they're trying to incentivize production and exploration in order to attract that investment, but on the federal side you're moving in the other direction, then you're really canceling those efforts out.
Right. Mr. Summers, how would you compare interacting with federal authorities on permitting and other matters to state regulators? For example, the Utah Division of Oil, Gas, and Mining, sometimes referred to as DOGM. Yeah. What are those 2 experiences like?
I think in many cases, as I mentioned in my testimony, it's very important that we protect primacy for states so that we can manage as many of these federal laws and regulations as possible. But in general, I mean, the state agencies tend to be more responsive because, frankly, we can call their bosses. I mean, we can call, the head of the Department of Natural Resources where Dogum is. We can, call the governor, legislators, and get responses there, whereas, trying to fix problems on a federal level becomes much more difficult, and not to say that we don't have opportunities to influence those agencies through working with our federal delegation and other things, but as a general principle, I think the government closest to the people functions the best, and we find that in regulatory agencies as well.
Do you find is there any kind of inferior environmental outcome or greater risk of environmental harm as a result of a decision where jurisdiction is vested in a state agency, for example, the Utah Division of Oil, Gas, and Mining, as compared to federal authorities?
We've not witnessed that in Utah.
So the biggest significant difference, if I'm understanding you correctly, is the amount of time, the amount of delay, and the uncertainty. Shorter, greater certainty with the states without a diminished environmental outcome.
Correct.
Thank you. Senator Heinrich.
Actually, Senator Murkowski hasn't had a chance to even have her first round, so I would defer to her.
My peripheral vision was off.
I know I'm so far down the dais here, but that's okay. I show up, and that's so much of what matters.
My wife would call that male refrigerator blindness, and it claims many victims.
I'm going to have to remember that one. I want to thank you for having this hearing as one that's been focused on the issue of critical minerals and the vulnerability that we have in this country when it comes to being able to access our own and the increasing reliance on countries like China. This is a key issue, and I'm glad that the committee is taking it up so early. Mr. Summers, I wanted to start with you. There was an interesting article in the Wall Street Journal just a bit ago entitled, "Why the U.S. Keeps Losing to China in the Battle Over Critical Minerals." You may have seen it, but it tells the story of Syrah. This is an Australian company that I have cited this story a fair amount in the Biden administration, because what we saw was hundreds of millions of U.S. taxpayer dollars that went to support that, even though they were planning on sourcing the graphite from a very unstable part of Mozambique. It's one of those sources of frustration. You watch this whole project. Syrah goes into force majeure last year, and so everything that the U.S. taxpayer has put out there is at risk, at jeopardy, and you've got continued unrest in Mozambique. To me, this was a situation where you had just no common sense when it came to the federal investment decisions. And then I will submit to you that we've got some opportunities in our own country to be smart about our investments, lower risk investments here at home. My colleagues have heard about the potential for Graphite One, the largest natural graphite deposit in North America. We pushed, we pleaded, we did everything that we could to raise the profile on this. We did get support from the Defense Production Act. That was helpful. But when it came to the Department of Energy, it was really pretty tough to get any attention here. So I'm looking at this, and at least with the previous administration, seeing this unwillingness for the federal government to invest in projects here at home. And so my question to you is whether or not you think it would be wise, advisable, to have some kind of a requirement for any federal investments in mineral processing to be tied, to the extent practical, to domestically sourced minerals. Because we know we're not doing the processing. We want to bring processing here. But also, it doesn't make sense if we're getting the raw materials from other countries. Speak to this, if you would, please.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that would be a very wise requirement. And again, in my testimony, I mentioned that just in Utah, we have 40 of the 50 critical minerals on the DOI list. You know, and you add the graphite that you mentioned in your home state and mineral occurrences in other U.S. states, there's really very little reason that we need to go outside of the U.S. to source these minerals. And again, if we have both the extraction and the processing happening here domestically, then that really does shore up our supply chain and ensure that we don't have those economic and national security risks. I would also say that in many cases, not only are there natural deposits, but in the case of graphite, for example, there's opportunities. You know, there are projects right now currently in Pennsylvania and West Virginia that are getting graphite from coal. You know, with off-gassing of hydrogen, which can be used for electricity generation. And so there's many opportunities for us to be innovative as well and not rely on unstable countries in order to extract the raw resources.
Well, thank you for that. Let me ask a question of you, Mr. Haddock. In your written testimony, you've briefly mentioned the Bureau of Mines. This was abolished back in the 90s. You didn't specifically call for its resurrection, but given the importance of what we're talking about here today, it's something that I've certainly thought about. We've got a Department of Energy. Maybe we want a Bureau of Mines to look at our mineral security and our competitiveness. So what do you think about the idea? What would a modern Bureau of Mines look like? What functions would they be responsible for?
Thank you, Senator. That's a great question. In my mind, as I was looking at these critical minerals bills, and everybody was talking about all the coordination between all these various agencies, and this agency could do this and that, it just felt like there is a need for centralization here. And also, one of the things that I've talked about before and I've advocated is there needs to be a knowledge base of, you know, as private explorers are out working, we need to find a way to be able to share the information that's critical to knowing where these byproduct minerals are in small concentrations. And so I don't know exactly what it would look like, but you know, I certainly know in a business world you would create a focus on that with a small group of people with the right expertise and focus on those very narrow questions.
Good. Well, thank you for that. That might be something that the committee would want to explore, Mr. Chairman. You know, we're trying to eliminate a lot of bureaucracy nowadays, but when you're focusing in an area as significant as this for our entire economy, it seems to me that we might want to give a little more definition. And so certainly something that I'd love to work with you all on. Thank you, and I appreciate all of you being here today. And Senator Heinrich, thank you for the courtesy of the refrigerator look over here.
Thanks so much. Excellent suggestion. Senator Heinrich.
I'm going to defer to Senator Hickenlooper. I know he has a second round.
Great. Let me get back to my question there. I got distracted for just that moment. That's always the case. You guys have been talking a lot about supply chain, and I think that that's at the essence of all these things. Again, I want to go back to Mr. Summers. The National Critical Minerals Council Act to ensure that we are, you know, coordinating minerals policy at the highest level of government. Can you kind of elaborate on why it's essential to elevate critical minerals to the highest levels of the White House, obviously, but also to the agency, and how a national council or a minerals advisor could enhance that?
Absolutely, and I'd like to echo what Mr. Haddock said. I think that, you know, more centralization in the federal government would be very beneficial in whatever form that takes, a Bureau of Mines or a National Critical Minerals Council or a Minerals Czar. I'm not sure exactly, you know, what that should look like in specific, but I think that ensuring that the federal government is working together, and you have the Department of Energy and Department of Interior, the Department of Defense, and, you know, the trade representative and others. I mean, all the different parts of government that need to be involved in these discussions so that, you know, we are, again, maximizing our opportunities to be self-sufficient with our critical mineral supply chain, and also dealing with trade issues and other other issues that can affect investment here in the U.S. is absolutely essential.
Right. I appreciate that. more than you can imagine. I think collaboration and coordination is going to be in high demand. Mr. Wood, this just, again, as someone who also loves trout, and like many of your members, like I enjoy taking the trout out of the water, but also putting them back.
Yes. That's good.
Yeah. We have I think we have some of the largest trout, I think, in the country. People don't recognize that yet.
Yes, you do.
What actions can Congress take to reduce the impacts of some of these new mining projects? What have we not talked about yet where we could get better value in protecting?
I think we've talked about several topics already that would reduce impact. I will say that modern mining is a lot different than historic mining practices. These are well-regulated industries, and most of them are well-capitalized. I do think that the two biggest problems with the mining law, I don't think are that unfixable. One is, as I mentioned earlier, creating a dedicated funding source or royalty. And the second issue would be making clear that there is discretion for denying a mine permit early in the process.
Right, I agree. Perfect, thank you. Appreciate that. Obviously, that's a discussion we could go on for some hours. I'll finish up, Mr. Haddock. We've talked about a better path forward for mining in this country by simpler permitting processes, faster responses, but making sure that we have the highest environmental standards. And I guess I could say actually to all witnesses, we've talked, or you've already covered a number of the permitting bottlenecks that mining companies face on projects. But as we resume on this committee bipartisan discussions at solutions, what would you think? Each can suggest one. What should be our highest priority?
I'll start past the Mineral Regulatory Clarity Act.
Okay, that's fair. Mr. Summers?
Again, I think that there's been a lot of discussion about permitting reform, and that's absolutely critical, and also litigation reform.
There you go.
And I would say, again, funding to clean up abandoned mines and allowing some more discretion in the process for areas where you shouldn't mine.
Right, absolutely. Well, the ranking member described the $56 billion backlog, $54 billion backlog, and yet the $1 billion a year that you mentioned really is almost just taking care of what's happening, day to day with existing mining as small as it is. But anyway, somehow that's got to come together as well, and as we get ultimate solutions. Anyway, thank you all. I appreciate your work and look forward to working with you going forward. I yield back.
Senator Heinrich. Okay. Good to wrap. Yep. Really appreciate all three of our witnesses for coming here today. You've offered some very valuable testimony that we've all benefited from. As you can tell, these are issues on which there is a lot of bipartisan consensus, not always on the discrete policy proposals at hand, but in many areas there is. At a minimum, there is a lot of bipartisan consensus over the importance of these issues, and that leads often to legislative consensus or very nearly such. We've got just some brief housekeeping before we wrap up. I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record some letters of support for S-714, the Critical Mineral Consistency Act, and S-544 from the following organizations: the National Mining Association, the American Exploration and Mining Association, Citizens for Responsible Energy Solutions also submitted one. And without objection, so ordered. The record for this hearing will remain open for 2 weeks. We thank the witnesses and we stand adjourned.